right, I guess we might as well get started. So, I'm Rich Festante. I'm a senior technical marketing engineer here at MobileIron, and this topic is near and dear to my heart. So I focus really mostly on cloud services and how it integrates across different platforms. This entire presentation is going to be about moving from your on-premises to the cloud, whether that's Office 365 or Salesforce One, or that's iOS, or Android for Work, or Windows 10. So you have all these different challenges as you move to the cloud. How do I secure my content? How do I secure my data? And ultimately, what happens when that device is trying to authenticate to cloud? So we're going to go through a lot of architectures. We're going to go through how different platforms work together. You're going to talk about iOS Managed Config. You've heard about the app config community. You've heard about MobileIron Access. We're going to dive a little bit into each of them to have an entire full solution for Office 365 and other service providers themselves. Everyone loves disclaimers, right? Go really quick. You don't need to read that. Good. But Vijay's presented on this for MobileIron Access of the cloud security challenge, right? The trusted user. For cloud services, you're typically going to use an identity provider. And we're going to go through the flows of what an identity provider provides today. So, user authentication, how does that move from on-premises to the cloud? Your Oktas of the world, your Microsoft ADFSs. But you really have to worry about the trusted device. How do I know that device is secure when I'm going to cloud services? And even if that device is secure and compliant, how do I know that the application that's going to the cloud is a sanctioned application that my administrator wants me to use? So Salesforce One is great. Salesforce has a huge ecosystem of ecosystem partners. Some of them can be used for offline access. Do I want to move all of my offline access for that user? You may not want to. So the agenda for today, briefly touching on it, right? So SSO alphabet soup. I use that because we use the word SSO, the acronym SSO, in so many different connotations. We're going to go through what SSO means to you as an enterprise, or what it means to me as trying to go through cloud services. Then we're going to go to identity architecture. Identity architecture may change depending on the platform that you're using. And if you're going from on-premises, where you have a hybrid approach of Microsoft ADFS, to a cloud identity provider like Okta, or if you're using Windows 10. And then we'll go through securing the device. All this means nothing if you're not securing the device through managed platform configurations. So iOS Managed Config, your Android for Work app restrictions, and Windows 10 with EDP in the future, Enterprise Data Protection. Then lastly, you're going to go through tying it all together. What does my end user see when I use cloud services? Like things like DEP, which they're talking about here, or device-based VPP. How does that all work and fit into a cloud services story? So let's go through it. SSO. Everybody hears the word Kerberos. If you're using Kerberos for Exchange, do we think of single sign-on as that? You can. You heard the term KCD. A lot of the professional services guys are talking about how to secure single sign-on for Exchange services. You may be able to use that for identity providers and using that into the cloud. SAML. That's a standard way to use cloud services. So your Salesforces of the world and your Google Apps of the world all typically use SAML as a trusted authentication mechanism, as a standard across all the different platforms. I put this up here because people say single sign-on maybe. I want to do end-user registration and use my identity provider for SAML. You could call it single sign-on. OAuth, another standard-based approach that's really picking up speed in the enterprise. I use the word Kerberos proxy. You may understand that as iOS single sign-on. It's another way to do Kerberos for iOS. And we're going to go through how that works for things like Salesforce One or even the Outlook app. And lastly, this is the glue. This is the user authentication. MobileIron Access isn't an identity provider. It's an IDP proxy, and we work together with all of our big partners to provide that trusted user. They provide that trusted user authentication. We provide the device compliance. The flow, right? So how do I authenticate to a cloud service today? Well, I have my identity provider, I have my device, and I have my service provider. The device is actually doing all the authentication. So the device wants to go to the service provider. I want to go to Box. So I go to the Box account, I go in through the Box for EMM application, and I put in my email address. When I put in my email address, or it could be pushed through iOS Managed Config, and when I put in that email address, it's actually redirected to my identity provider. That creates a secure authentication, so I don't have to put my credentials to the service provider. Now, the trusted authentication is from the device to the IDP. Once I authenticate, the device then sends back that token, say, I have authenticated to the IDP, give me access to the service provider, to Box. And that's when you get all your data. Very simple workflow. We're going to see how it works with other kinds of areas. This is a little more detail. I have my device that's trying to authenticate to my service provider. The service provider says, you need to go to a federated domain because you're using an IDP, an identity provider. That device then goes to my identity provider for authentication. That terms of authentication is dictated by the device. So it can be Windows authentication. You know that as Kerberos, or it could be NTLM. It could be forms-based. What you're seeing here is the email address and login. It's just a web page that you see. Or it could be, say, a user certificate. Once I authenticate to the identity provider, it generates a token and sends it back to the device. And then from the device says, I have the token, give me access. This is really just to set the stage of how, if you're using a cloud service today, this is what your authentication is. Nothing has changed. But I want to go into the identity architecture because in that current state, there is no conditional access. How do I know that device is compliant? It's really just allowing really any device that has the right credentials to access that service provider. So I'm going to start with the identity architecture. And this is kind of an eyesore of a chart, a little of what your typical diagram may look like for your network. I have my device that's trying to access all my service providers. And for those that are on premises, I have a hybrid approach for, say, Microsoft ADFS, or I have Ping Federate. These are all load balancers that are going to different geolocations. So depending on my device location, you can have a global load balancer, and that's going to determine where you are and where you should go. On the DMZ front, you have a proxy, not Sentry. It's going to be an ADFS proxy if you're using Microsoft ADFS services, or just a web application proxy that forwards that request to my identity provider. Since the identity provider doesn't sit in the DMZ, it's still on the corporate network. So you actually need a way to go from the DMZ to corporate, and you use that typically through a proxy. How many people are using App Tunnel or Tunnel today? Okay, that's our per app VPN story for MobileIron Sentry. So if you're using that, you need to add a couple more sentries to that mix in the DMZ. So you have a proxy in the DMZ, you have a sentry in the DMZ, and you spread that across all different geolocations. Is that pretty much what you see in your environment today? And that's the flow. VJ talks about MobileIron Access. And what I see is really the big value for MobileIron Access, if you have an on-premises hybrid deployment for cloud services, is being able to join that proxy now with MobileIron Access. So your web application proxies for your cloud services can be joined into just one sentry. So you no longer have to have 2 sentries in high availability and 2 proxies in high availability per region. Now you could just have 2 MobileIron sentries, 2 MobileIron accesses. And they all get globally load balanced because it's a stateless sentry. And they could all be load balanced, just like a proxy. A very simple architecture. That's one way to do it for MobileIron access. It's available for iOS today, very shortly for Android and for Windows 10. Android for work and for Windows 10. And this is the actual flow for MobileIron access. So I have my identity provider, I have MobileIron access, but it really is determined about the device. Device goes to the service provider, just like anything else. When I go to the service provider, I get redirected to MobileIron access. MobileIron access sees the compliance of the device, make sure that it's managed and that it's a managed application. And then when everything is great, it sends that request to my identity provider. It's a delegated IDP proxy. And when it's going to the IDP does the authentication. So the authentication goes from the device to the identity provider, just like you would before when we started off the presentation. MobileIron access is just to make sure that the access control piece is there and the device is compliant. That was with the on-premises approach. Well, what about if you have a cloud IDP? Okta and Ping1 are one of our partners for MobileIron access. This is the first phase of where we are for MobileIron access today. MobileIron access will still sit in your DMZ, and it'll be able to communicate with Okta or Ping1 for that communication. So everything that you saw for the on-premises approach, for Microsoft ADFS or for others, or Ping Federate, work very similarly to Okta and to Ping1 in the cloud. That was MobileIron access. Really quick, really going through it. But MobileIron access is really just one piece of the MobileIron access control story. Some people have heard of Azure Active Directory or moving to Office 365. That's a requirement when you move to Office 365. You need to have an Azure Active Directory account in order for you to access all of your cloud services. Well, they've gone a step further, and you're able to integrate with Azure Active Directory for that. So MobileIron has an Azure application. You're welcome to go into the Azure App Store and look at the MobileIron EMM application, because that is actually doing the integration between MobileIron Cloud or Core, and that's going into the Azure Active Directory account. And we're going to go through the flows of how that works. So what does that mean? How do I integrate to Azure Active Directory? And what does that mean from an EMM integrating with Azure Active Directory? So I have my Windows 10 device that's on the left-hand side. I'm trying to access my service providers, Office 365. I'm trying to access Exchange Online. I'm going through the Outlook client. And when I try to authenticate, MobileIron is actually sending the compliance of that device to Azure Active Directory. So all the things that you've seen in terms of the ecosystem, whether you're malware, in terms of your FireEyes of the world and such, still comes up into play when you're sending the report, the device compliance, into Azure Active Directory. MobileIron access isn't a part of this workflow. This is just another way if you want to go completely zero footprint for Windows 10. Azure Active Directory enables you to do this today. So how does it do it? My device, I'm trying to, I check in, right? Interval based off of the EMM. For cloud, it's going to be at 1 hour. For core, you could set it for 4 or however you see fit. But the device checks in to MobileIron. When it checks into MobileIron actually, on behalf of that user, is authenticating to Azure Active Directory to give compliance based off of that. So I get a token. I'm a trusted application in the Azure storefront to communicate and do various things in Azure. What MobileIron does today, reports compliance. Is the device compliant? Is it managed? And if it's not, it sends it to Azure Active Directory. And then Azure Active Directory will then forward that and block that communication from happening. That was a really quick way to do identity architecture, but it means nothing without securing the device. So I have my services set up, my architecture is all set up. How do I make sure that the devices are set up correctly? So there's going to be iOS managed config, there's going to be iOS managed apps, there could be AFW app restrictions, could be Windows 10 EDP. I'm going to go through it. What MobileIron cares about is device trust. John Morgan was talking about all the ecosystem work that we're trying to work on and our vast ecosystem of partners, because we feel we are best of breed, and we feel that access control is our IP, our best way to help. But we do that with a lot of help from our ecosystem partners. So your malware, your app reputation vendors, or you're doing network access control and other various ecosystem partners. We wouldn't be here to be best of breed without them. When I'm going through configurations, what does that mean? The app config community, it's all based off a standard approach for iOS. Salesforce One, it's one of the big ones that's doing for iOS managed config. So I can go from Salesforce One, and then when I enroll my device, I could convert that from an unmanaged application to a managed application. So I get all the things that I can do for a managed app. My per app VPN policies. I could remove that application when the device is not compliant or it retires. So using that managed config is really important when you're moving to the cloud. Box for EMM is another that uses iOS managed config, uses app config community. On the Android for Work front, we have application restrictions, a standard way to do restrictions that are similar to iOS managed config. So you can do things in the application to secure it, or to enable that application to say, I want to give an email address and automatically log that person in. For our Android for Work, it's one binary, one application, but you see it in the work profile and you see it in the personal side. And you're really only worrying about the profile for a BYU case. Windows 10, it's going to bring a lot of new features in the upcoming release called Enterprise Data Protection. And with Enterprise Data Protection, you could allow the certain applications that are for my enterprise to only communicate with other enterprise apps. And even going further than that, EDP allows you, if it's an enlightened application, to have personal data and work data all in one application and separate that. So it's going to go one step further with it. Even though it is one application, it could separate that data and do things like encrypting that file, encrypting that data in traffic. So how does it work? Briefly touched on it. I have my device that's trying to authenticate to the enterprise. And inside that application, it's not allowing my work side to communicate with my personal side. So I don't want to send an email and copy that data from that email to, say, my messages or my personal side for Facebook or Twitter, or anything like that. So it's separating that personal and work. similar to what you've seen for iOS with managed config and managed apps, and Android for work profile. There should be an asterisk there, not quite available, but that is the future of Windows 10. I'm going to throw everybody for a loop here. Has anybody heard of the Intune MAM coexistence today? Why is MobileIron talking about Intune? So, Intune, they've released a MAM-only enrollment to coexist with other EMMs. So the biggest question that we get at MobileIron is, how do you secure the Office suite? All right? The Outlook of the world, your Microsoft Words, your Excels. Microsoft does it a little bit different than a standard way. It's not, they don't do it through an iOS managed config or Android for work restrictions. They do that through the Azure portal. So it's a separate portal. It's not a part of the Intune management portal. It's part of the Azure portal that you add to an Intune blade. And you set up your policies based off of what you want to do. So cut, copy, and paste control is there. A lot of them, and we'll go through all the detail of what is available for Intune MAM. But they also do, interestingly enough, they now do, for iOS, they do iOS managed config to push down a UPN variable. So I could log in and say, if it's coming from this enterprise, it's a managed application, I could send that UPN down to the applications for Microsoft Office. You know, the bad thing about getting a presentation done early is that now there's new applications that are supported for Intune MAM. So all of these are, and there are differences between them for iOS and for Android. Added to this now, there's the remote desktop application, RDP, and OneNote for iOS, and Android has a lot more. So we'll get this updated, but all the applications that you're using for the Office suite for iOS and for Android could be used for the Intune MAM coexistence piece. So if you're doing iOS managed apps and managed config, the one step further, if you have an EMS license already for Intune, you could use that for Intune MAM coexistence. All right, well, how do I authenticate? Went through, as an administrator, I could lock this down to say, only allow certain applications to access these applications or that data to access that data. Now we're going to go through how the device authenticates. With MobileIron Access, you saw the flow earlier. But for MobileIron Access to work, we need to have MobileIron Tunnel. And we're sending down this config for MobileIron Tunnel to work with that per app application. Not just iOS. This would be the flow for Android. This would be the flow for Windows 10. It's all standard-based SAML way to do it. To go one step further, does anybody deploy iOS single sign-on today in the enterprise? Well, if you're going to, you've seen it for on-premises deployments. So I'm trying to access Safari with SharePoint. You could do very similar things in the cloud. This may sound kind of weird, you're doing Kerberos in the cloud, but since you are authenticating to my identity provider, my Microsoft ADFSs, that do Kerberos, MobileIron Tunnel and Sentry and Access can play a pivotal role in making it easier for the end user to authenticate. So my biggest problem when I first started talking about single sign-on with a cloud service, I have Google Apps. As MobileIron, we have Google Apps, we have Office 365, we have Box. All of these applications, from an ADFS point of view, are different relying party trusts. And that means I'm signing in to single sign-on, but I need to sign on three other times. It'll work if single sign-on will go through and share that token between the same developer, say Microsoft, Outlook, in Microsoft Excel and Microsoft PowerPoint, I won't have to sign in again through Microsoft. But for Google Apps, it was kind of difficult. You need to sign on again, even though technically called single sign-on. With iOS single sign-on, for those applications that support it, it's now going to do Kerberos once I authenticate. So I'll be authenticated through Kerberos. That means that Google Apps will work automatically, and any other applications that are connected to my identity provider that are using Kerberos will go right through. The user won't have to authenticate again. Very cool. It's something that you should be looking at. Just available for iOS. Just want to make sure. Yeah, can you just go up to the mic, if that's okay?
So this method requires you to enter your password at one time to get the token so that you can use that to authenticate future times. Yep. Is there a way to eliminate the need to enter that password the first time?
Yeah, so the question was, in the current implementation of iOS single sign-on, you have to enter in your credentials once, your password once. Is there any way to do this without using, say, something like a certificate or something else that doesn't provide that you don't have to authenticate again? Stay tuned. Right now, that's a current implementation, but there are ways to enhance this. On the device join, or how do I authenticate, authentication, that was through MobileIron Access. Another way to do this, to authenticate to my cloud service, is Azure Active Directory. And Azure AD join brings a lot of cool features into the enterprise. When I do an Azure AD join, I automatically get my MDM policies, my configs, all of these things, and I register with Azure Active Directory, to the cloud. But MobileIron is doing the correlation as well. So I'm also registering to MobileIron, and then MobileIron is seeing that device ID, and it's correlating that with the compliance of the device. Azure AD brings a lot of cool things to it. For the Office Suite, how many people are using the Office Suite for Windows 10 or just Windows desktops today? Has to be 90% of you. Most of the people are using it. With the Office 2013 and Office 2016, it's actually modern ADAL authenticated, where if I do an Azure AD join, I'm automatically going right into the Office Suite, Office apps. So I don't have to configure Exchange or Office 365. It's going to go right in because I've already authenticated to Azure Active Directory. Went through device authentication. Now we're going to go through, well, from an administrator, how do I make sure that the user is authenticating or I'm providing the best use case for my end devices? And there's a lot of different ways to do it for visibility and for DLP controls. Salesforce is a big app config community vendor that we use. Without having a presentation, I wanted to give substance to everybody. This is the iOS managed configs that we've used that you'll see pretty soon with Salesforce 1. It's okay, they said it's okay. But you could do things like the app service host. So I could put it in my Salesforce tenant information in there automatically into the application when I push that down through a managed app. I could even create a label and say this is the label. If I have multiple, I could do multiple labels, multiple service hosts. DLP controls. This is where you can clear the clipboard. It's your cut, copy, and paste controls from Salesforce 1 to, say, an unmanaged app. And the last one is requiring certificate authentication. One way to authenticate to Salesforce 1 would be to do, say, a user-provided certificate to Microsoft ADFS. And this will require the user to go through that. This is coming for iOS. Just wanted to give that. Oh, on the right side as well, this is the custom plist that you would push down through MobileIron. But you'll see it on on MobileIron Cloud and other interfaces of the app config community, make it easier to put in those values and automatically populate that in the future. So that's one of the benefits of app config community. One standardized way to do it, and makes it easier for the administrator to configure it. But they also do it for Android for Work. So very similar things, configurations for Android for Work that are available today. So app service hosts, same thing. And the host labels create different labels. It requires cert auth, and this is where I map the certificate alias. So Android knows where the certificate, or what certificate I should use to prompt me when I go into the application. Has anybody configured Android for Work app restrictions yet? Well, the application configurations are done in the app catalog, actually. So for iOS managed config, you do that. You go into, if you're using core or cloud, you use an iOS managed config and you configure that policy and send down that plist. For Android for Work, when I'm adding the application into into my core or into my cloud, that wizard is actually driven by the cloud vendors or the developer vendors that are using Android for Work. So all of these restrictions are pushed automatically in through Google Play. Box for EMM, they're also using standardized approaches. So for iOS, the public ID is really important for Box. This is how we correlate and say, for Box for EMM, to have integrations from core and cloud, that we push that down and say, this is our public ID for this tenant, for my Box account. Same thing with management ID. And the last one is my favorite, user email address. So making it easier for the end user to think, oh, how should I format my email address to log into Box? A lot of questions, depending on your enterprise, you may have a different, their UPN may not be the same as their email address that they may permit or may authenticate. So you can make sure that they're authenticating with the right credentials, right email address, so they know to get redirected to my identity provider. The right side, it's the plist, custom plist. And like any good vendor, they have also Android for Work app restrictions. So their user email address, their public ID, EMM name is different from iOS to Android for Work. You just choose MobileIron for the EMM name, and then it'll correlate that and do different compliance actions based off of it. Now we get to the big one. So Office 365, a lot of different ways to do it. We're going to go through the configurations for that, whether they're iOS managed config or they're done in the Azure portal. This is the first part of what I call the Intune MAM coexistence, or the Intune MAM only enrollment. This is not an integration with MobileIron. This is being complementary to MobileIron. So if you have an EMS suite already, you have Azure Active Directory Premium, you have Azure RMS, and they throw an Intune with there. You could use Intune for iOS and for Android, and also use MobileIron for all the things that you need to do for managed devices. So let Intune do some of the custom Office apps and manage just that security for DLB controls. And MobileIron will push the applications, do device-based VPP, all the things that you've done and you've seen in the presentations for what you need for a device, device enrollment. So, preventing iTunes and iCloud, you could set that in the Intune MAM coexistence. The allowing the app to transfer data to other applications. Say, if it's a managed application, I want to restrict that to other managed applications. So it's transferring data, it's also receiving data. You can set different rules based off of that. So if you're more, typically it'll be allowing it from an unsecure way to a secure way, but you don't want to go from a secure way to an unsecure way. If you want to keep all of your content, say in your SharePoint Onlines or your OneDrives, you can prevent save as to say, you can't save this anywhere else. It has to stay in my corporate area. And the cut, copy, and paste controls are one of the biggest things, right? So you want to prevent it for iOS or for Android well, Android for work, it prevents that from the Android for work profile. But for iOS, this is the way to restrict that for cut, copy, and paste controls. But then there's a second piece of Intune MAM. That's just a nice, pretty screenshot. What you saw in that chart just translates into what you see. This is the next area of the Intune coexistence. How many people require a second factor authentication when accessing any of your Office? It could be Office, it could be any applications. How many are using App Connect? So a couple of people are using App Connect for that two-factor authentication. The Office apps, they're not using App Connect, but a lot of people do want that two-factor authentication in there when they go to, say, Outlook apps. This is where you require a simple PIN. For iOS, you could use your Touch ID as my second factor of authentication. Or I could say require corporate credentials for my PIN. So doing my corporate credentials twice over. But that was just Microsoft's way to support that for their Office apps. Not using iOS Managed Config or Android for Work app restrictions. This is done in the Azure portal. I think I said that a couple times. It's complementary to MobileIron. It's not an integration with MobileIron. Just want to make that clear. And this is a little blurry screenshot of what it looks like on the Azure portal. And if you have any questions about it, we'll be over there by the answers bar and go through the Azure portal and go through the configurations and how you set this up for Intune coexistence and how that works with MobileIron. But they also use iOS Managed Config. So they have a proprietary way in the Intune Azure portal, and they also have a standard way to do it through iOS Managed Config. So I can push down my UPN variable, or whatever variable I want, for that user to authenticate into my Office apps. The key value pair will be Intune MAM UPN. And then for core, for cloud, you could put that in a string. For core, I could just put in my email address, my $sign email, and that'll populate for that user account. This is still brand new, so we're still going through it and testing it. Like, we're going through it. We're seeing some inconsistencies with it. Try it out, see what happens. I've seen it work, or a couple of people have seen it work, when you're going from one application and trying to open up into another, and it forces that UPN. But in the future, you may see it work a little bit better. Another complementary piece of a cloud services story. So MobileIron brings a lot of things to different platforms, whether it's iOS or Android for Work or for Windows 10. For iOS, encryption is built into the OS, right? It's a sandbox application. I can only get into different managed apps, and I can restrict that based off of my corporate policy. Android for Work, encryption is also built into the operating system. Before I inflate that profile for Android for Work, it has to be encrypted. But it also separates those profiles. So going from my personal side to my other side, this is a separate profile that's in Android, separate Linux profile. Windows 10, it's kind of a hybrid approach today. You have your Win32 applications and you have modern applications. The modern applications are just as similar as iOS and for Android for work, where they could provide those sandbox applications and only allow applications to communicate with each other or separate from each other. And it brings EDP, Enterprise Data Protection. How do I make sure that those applications are only communicating with other business applications? Or making sure that my data from that business application can't get stored to my personal OneDrive. So one of the EDP cases is going from business side, I'm trying to go to OneDrive. It's only going to be stored encrypted on my local computer. It's not going to go up to OneDrive personal. On the complementary piece, Azure RMS is another key component. When you're using the Office apps, or if you're using the EMS suite that Microsoft provides, Azure RMS brings another set for encrypting those files in transit or on your device. So I can't go from my personal side to my business side because that data is encrypted through Azure RMS, through the Microsoft Office applications. Microsoft Office applications have a multi-identity piece to it, where I could set up my personal, because I just want to, I like Word. But it also has the business side, and I don't want them to meet. And you can set up rules based off of that to say Azure RMS should block that from going through and making sure that that data is encrypted. So Azure RMS is across the full suite of iOS and Android and Windows 10. I thought I was going to get this question like right from the start. What about a CASB? All right. Does anybody deploy CASBs today? SkyHighs of the world, Netscopes of the world. Well, they are really big into enterprise data cloud protection. And I use that term, data cloud protection, because they're really focused on the data. And that's great, and we are complementary to them. MobileIron, we're all about endpoint trust. So how do I make sure that that device is trusted through all my ecosystem partners? And that device is compliant. So sending that compliance through Azure Active Directory or to MobileIron Access to say block that access. But Access also brings in a reporting aspect of it. When everything that goes through my cloud service to Office 365 or to Box, MobileIron Access sees that. So whether they should have access or they shouldn't, I could do different reporting aspects of that and check it out, see who's trying to hit Office 365, from what IP, from what user agent, and you could do different rules based off of that, see what's going on with your network and who may have credentials that they shouldn't. For a CASB, they care about the data usage. How is that data getting stored? Where is that getting sent? And they see that, see where is it going from US to China or US to Russia or to different areas, and seeing where that data in transit is going. And it could do different threat intelligence analytics, see if that is a security risk or not. And you could look at that. You could look at the audit trail of it. But CASBs are really about managing risk. And that's why they're really all about data today. For MobileIron, for the cloud access security, we care about the application that's trying to access Salesforce or to Office 365. So app trust is very big to us. But there's also device trust. We have root detection that's built into Mobile at Work or MobileIron Go. And you have all the ecosystem partners that support that. So whether we check the root detection of it, we need that one step further for our ecosystem partners to determine if the applications that they're using are reputable or not. From a CASB perspective, they could do that based off of a proxy that works complementary to MobileIron. Or it could be API based to check that cloud service to see how that API is working and how that data is being accessed. Different ways to do it for different CASBs. For data protection, briefly went through that, the iOS managed apps. I can't open up into different managed apps. I can't go into my personal profile to my work profile. And EDP restricts that going from a personal side to the business side, whether that's inside the application through Enlightened apps or just through any applications that I use that are specified for EDP. And CASBs, they're really big into DLP control or network DLP. So for that data in transit, it's going to encrypt that data and make sure that that data is secure. So having that both, having MobileIron and a CASB or MobileIron plus Azure RMS is pretty pivotal, is pretty important to move to a cloud service. We like to say that we're best of breed. We're not going to be the best of everything. We're not going to be that one stack for everything. So we want to give solutions to help out what we can do and provide solutions for what else you need. And lastly, we're just going to tie it all together. So it's going to go on different platforms. I have an iOS device. Well, when I go on my iOS device, I want to enroll into MDM. Well, how could I do that? There's a lot of presentations based off of the device enrollment program or my BioID use case. If it's device enrollment program, I just have to power on that device, put in my credentials, and I'm ready to go. Automatically goes into my core cloud. I'm automatically registered, automatically secure with MobileIron. But then you want to distribute the apps, right? From a cloud services area, well, it's not important unless I have the applications that could support cloud services, right? It has to get to the end user. And if I'm using DEP, I'm using supervise, I can automatically push that to the device. Or if I'm doing device-based VPP, that's for my enterprise, may not be supervised, it could be supervised or not. They won't have to put in their iTunes ID in order for them to get those applications. It's based off of a license. So whether it's a paid license or it's free like Microsoft Outlook or Google Apps or Google Drive. So I went through the app distribution. Well, how do I get all of the configs in there? Then you send down iOS managed device config to those applications like Salesforce One or to Box for EMM or the Outlook apps and do all my restrictions based off of it. So if I'm not allowing certain configurations for that device and I'm locking that down, this is where I would send it, right at enrollment. But they have to use it. And iOS makes it really, really easy with iOS single sign-on to access those applications through the identity provider. This would bring you, so I would go up, I'd put in, so if I'm going to Salesforce One, I already have my tenant information set up, and that tenant information knows that I am tunneled through. I could access my identity provider securely through Kerberos. It's going to pop me for iOS single sign-on. So without having to really do anything in the application for Salesforce One, I can get that prompt and I can just authenticate. That's all the user has to do. They don't have to put in their email address. The only thing they have to do is put in their credentials. And once you authenticate through iOS single sign-on, you're able to access any other applications that are in your managed apps that support iOS single sign-on. It's a very cool way to do it. Now we can go through Android for Work. But how does Android for Work work similarly to a device enrollment? Well, you have Samsung Knox enrollment, where it's a very similar approach to how you do it for DEP. You upload that into the portal and you get your Samsung devices. It doesn't have to be Knox compatible or Knox enabled. It's just their way to enroll Samsung devices in there. If you're using Android for work, using device owner, just using corporate devices, you could use a provisioner app and just bump that application and hand it over to any of your employees or your customers. Android for Work brings silent install to the mix, or you can do app distribution through the app catalog. So when I enroll and I inflate that profile into Android for Work, I can get all of my applications that I need for work, whether they're in-house applications through the Google Play Store or public applications that are in Android for Work. And then your cut, copy, and paste control. So it is going from the work side to the personal side. You can restrict things like cut, copy, and paste. And for MobileIron tunnel areas, you could apply that configuration to Android for Work and only allow those applications to go through that tunnel. Application authentication today, there is no iOS single sign-on for Android for Work. They you typically do forms-based authentication. You could maybe be able to do certificate authentication depending on the developer itself. So some developers support it, some may not. But that's really a developer way. And then finally, Windows 10. Enrollment starts with Azure Active Directory. That's a very easy way, out of the box, go right through there, and I can enroll into Azure Active Directory, enroll into MDM, and go right through. But I could also do the MDM way to do it through Windows 8.1 or Windows Phone 8.1. Or if you really, really like a bulk install, you could do provisioning packages and do an ISO for things like kiosk mode or assigned access. App distribution. MDM provides Win32 applications to be pushed silently today. And in the future, you'll see a lot of silent installs for modern applications in the Windows storefront. This is where you'd set up all of my enterprise data protection controls. Which apps should be able to access each other? Which ones shouldn't? Which one should be encrypted? Which one shouldn't? And for Windows 10 today, you could do forms-based and certificate-based authentication. Maybe in the future you could do Kerberos. Kerberos typically has only really been for domain-joined Windows 10 devices, but we're investigating how we could do it for outside of the domain, through Azure Active Directory or through others. Last slide, we went through all these different architectures, went through how to do it on a different device. But MobileIron Access, Azure Active Directory, our integration with Azure Active Directory, complementary to CASBs and such, would all play a pivotal role in cloud services. We're going to play a really important role, but we're just one role in a much bigger area. And finally, trusted user. Trusted users with an identity provider. MobileIron isn't going to solve that. But we will pass that on for things like when the device is trusted or when the application is trusted. And then all of these play a pivotal role. MobileIron Access, Azure Active Directory, and CASBs. From the references point of view, we've published a white paper on our Salesforce site for Intune coexistence on how Intune coexistence works. Just because a lot of people may not know that if you already have Intune, you could work and you could coexist with MobileIron. There's MobileIron VPN tunnel technologies, which is really the foundation for how MobileIron Access works. And the third piece is kind of going through a high level of what you want to do with securing Office 365. And with that, that's pretty much just cloud services in a nutshell. But Very high level. We could always go into more detail, but if any questions, let me know. Yeah.